Greetings, friends. We're happy to be with you. I'm glad to share this opportunity with our Chief Legal Counsel, Allie Tomberlin, and we would like to have a really quick conversation to address what may be on your mind related to the latest low-performing schools legislation and mandatory improvement plans and how that impacts you. So our goal today is really to try to briefly answer the questions of why are we here and what is the impact to you. I will start just to briefly review that the legislature in the very late moments of final session this fall added language to the budget bill that redefined what a low-performing school is. And while many of our schools are working hard and making growth, one of the things that happened was that the definition added a school having to make high growth in order not to be classified as a low-performing school. And that sort of created a domino of other legislation that I'm going to let Allie share in more detail with you.
Okay, so you've heard a lot about mandatory improvement plans in low-performing schools. One of the big differences, the dominoes in legislation, is that for years we have not had schools identified as low-performing. It just hasn't come up, even though there's been a mechanism for what to do with low-performing schools in North Carolina law. There haven't been any actually identified as low-performing until September when the legislation was passed, and then October 1st when the state board named schools as low performing. So there are 29 schools in our school district that were named as low performing based on the criteria in the statute. And that triggered legislation for us to do what's called a mandatory improvement plan process in those 29 schools. So what Dr. Emery and I are talking about today is really only applicable to your school if your school is identified as one of the 29 low-performing schools. As a teacher in that school or as a licensed employee in that school, you're going to see some changes in the way you are evaluated. You're used to going into the NCSIS system and being set up on maybe an abbreviated or a full evaluation cycle. You're used to having pre-conferences and observations and post-conferences and an evaluation at the end of the year. That system is going to change for those of you who are licensed employees in one of these low-performing schools. And the reason it's changing is because now we're required to use a mandatory improvement plan evaluation process. And that process is not very clearly spelled out for us, unfortunately, in the law. The law is very general. What it says is that employees who are licensed employees in low-performing schools have to be evaluated early enough in the year so that if there are problems, they could be put on a mandatory improvement plan. So obviously it doesn't give us a whole lot to go on, and our school district has had to come up with a process that would be fair and applicable across all of these 29 schools to make sure that, first of all, principals are able to do these evaluations early enough in the year, and also so that we have a process that still is fair to teachers and not so extraordinary or different from the prior process that you don't understand what you're being evaluated based on. So what we can tell you is that you're still going to be evaluated based on the same standards that you're used to being evaluated on. In fact, we're going to continue to use the NCSIS system. We're just going to have to trick it a little bit because we can't make it do necessarily everything that we want to do. We have to ask principals to look at you on all standards. So what that means is that if you were on an abbreviated evaluation cycle this year, so that you're only looking at 2 standards in CSIS, we're now going to have to go back and move you to what looks like a full cycle so that the principal can access all of those standards for your evaluation. The bottom line for many of you is that you'll see some changes when you go into that system. You'll see that things have been moved around a little bit, and that's really just to allow the principals to access the forms that they need to access in order to be able to evaluate you on all standards. Observation-wise, you're also going to see some differences. So some of you might have one observation. You may have already been observed this year, so you might not have any more observations before you're evaluated by your principal. Others of you may be used to being observed once, and you might find that you're observed 2 or 3 times for observations that last 20 minutes or longer. We're leaving that up to principals. The way principals are deciding who gets observed how many times is based on what they already know about you. If they feel like everything you've showed is excellent, wonderful, above board, then they might not observe you any extra times. If they feel like what they've seen, they have a couple areas of concern, maybe there's 1 or 2 areas where you're just not quite satisfactory, they might observe you more times. And if you're somewhere in the middle, you might get 1 observation or 2 observations. So when you are noticing these changes in your school, your principal's going to talk to you and let you know how many observations you should expect to have, by what date you're probably going to be evaluated. We've set 3 different timelines. One is a February deadline, one is a March deadline, and one is an April deadline. And those deadlines for evaluations depend on where the principal believes the teacher currently is and how they're performing at school. So you'll see a change in potentially how many observations you get. You'll see a change in the online system. You might have been on an abbreviated, and now you're going to notice that your system gets moved to full so that the principal can access all of those standards. And you're also going to notice a change probably on when your full evaluation, your final evaluation conference is going to take place, because rather than it taking place at the end of the year, it'll either be in February, March, or April most likely. So we have bullet or charts to help describe kind of how this is working. It's hard to explain without looking at the paper where we've created the chart, but really what Dr. Emery and I wanted to explain to you today is that you will see some of these changes. It is out of the ordinary for these 29 schools. We've not gone through a full mandatory improvement plan evaluation process like this. But we really wanted you to know why you're seeing a change in the process. We wanted you to know that it's the same change that you're going to see across the school district. And we wanted you to know that we're doing our best to make sure that we have a system that's fair for everyone, so that nobody is surprised by any evaluation at the end of the process. The other last thing that we want to mention is what happens if you do find, once you go through that evaluation, what happens if you're not proficient on any standard on your evaluation. Because that's another difference in the law. So at that point, under the mandatory improvement plan process, your principal can opt to put you on a mandatory improvement plan unless they decide that demotion or dismissal is appropriate. So we would expect that if you are not proficient in an area where you were expected to show proficiency, we would expect that your principal is going to bring a recommendation to either put you on a mandatory improvement plan or to move for demotion or dismissal. I think the mandatory improvement plan process is one that can be used and should be used to improve someone's performance. So the mandatory improvement plan is a piece of paper, I think it's 2 sides, it would be up to 2 sides. It would describe the area where there's a deficiency, how the school district is going to support you in improving that area of deficiency, what the expected level of performance is, and then it's going to give a reasonable amount of time for you to improve that deficiency. The statute says the reasonable amount of time can't take any more than 90 days. So it doesn't mean that you get 90 days necessarily, it just means that it can't take any longer than 90 days or go into the next school year. So depending on what the area of deficiency is, we might see different timelines for how long people have to improve. And then you'll be reassessed again at the end of that process. So that's another little difference for the 29 schools. That's a difference in the legislation that principals in these schools can recommend teachers go on mandatory improvement plans. Another difference, and the last difference I'll tell you about, is that there's a catch-all in the statute where if the principal feels like any licensed employee in the school is performing in such a way that they're actually causing harm to the school environment, then the principal can put them on a mandatory improvement plan immediately without regard to the results of any evaluation. Clearly, when the legislature passed this legislation, it was their intent that there would be extremely high accountability in schools that are identified as low performing. And that's the statute we've been given to work with, so we're going to do our best to work within those confines and make sure that we uphold the purpose of the statute as best we can, but still do it within a context that teachers understand what you're being evaluated on, why recommendations for a certain number of observations might be made, why a recommendation for a mandatory improvement plan might be made. Our hope is that through this process, no licensed employee is in the dark or uncertain about why you've been evaluated the way you've been evaluated.
I would just like to sort of wrap this up by saying we are not a district that is afraid of accountability. This climate of accountability is important to all of us, you and me. We're a continuous improvement district, and all of us, myself included, my evaluation this year has 3 separate monitoring cycles, so whether you're being observed once or twice or multiple times, you are not alone, and we know there's a great deal of anxiety with the labels and maybe some lack of recognition that people are working really hard. So what I would ask you to do is just to stay in that continuous improvement mentality. We all have areas that we can learn and grow and improve, and especially as it relates to outcomes for our students. If you have questions, as Allie referred to, we have this chart. We're happy to answer them. You can contact first your principal. Principals in our schools have spent a significant amount of time with this, so they should be able to help you, and if not, please contact Human Resources or Legal or Superintendent's Office, and we will get you an answer to those questions as quickly as possible. Thank you for all that you're doing. We're going to get through this together as a district and achieve those 3 important goals that we've set for our students.